Welcome, everyone, to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, National Retrospective, where we cover the discography of one of indie rock's most prominent names. And today, we are going to be discussing, I think, one of the technical considered band's big three of records, the second one of which is Boxer, an album that I think most could make an argument for being this band's most beloved record overall, in fact.
It's always a real coin toss between Boxer and High Violet for the band's most kind of like critically well regarded, and like the album where like most people, like longtime fans, kind of came on board, where they were kind of at their saturation point. Boxer was kind of the breakthrough album in a lot of ways. Like Alligator did very well, considerably better than their first two records, which both essentially flopped. But even still, there wasn't a sense of momentum around the National with Alligator quite yet. They were still kind of an underground indie band. And I think that a lot of alternative music media were kind of waiting for them to refine the, I guess, for lack of a better word, messiness of Alligator into something more cogent, coherent, and smoothed out. And that is exactly what they did with Boxer. It is the band's most, I would say, smoothly oiled and well-designed record from front to back, the most concise National record, the most consistent National record in terms of not really throwing any particular curveballs at you, but really delivering a beautifully coherent and warm sound that feels very holistic and satisfying as a full-length album experience. And also, quite critically as well, delivering songs that could immediately stand out as some of the best material that came out in the year 2007. I mean, let alone in this band's career. I mean, this was such an arrival record for the National. Like, after proving themselves so strongly with Alligator, an amazing album that still remains my favorite National record personally, Boxer is where I feel like they tied together all of their greatest strengths, trimmed away some of the noisier, harsher excesses, which they would return to on subsequent records in some ways, but they really refined the idea and kind of crystallized the idea of who they were in terms of their image of a band. This smartly dressed, suited up, jet black, wine glass in hand, one hand, microphone in the other, dour expressions, but also kind of ready to party as well. Like the sense that they were this band of professionals that also kind of, where the professionalism belied an underlying kind of crumbling emotional state, right? And it was this kind of archetype of indie in a certain sense that it personified, or at least like I suppose the line between indie and classic rock in a certain sense, because a lot of what else was happening that was happening in indie had a more sort of laissez-faire presentation style, I suppose, a more sort of like freakier hipster aesthetic, whereas the National's hipster aesthetic was much more kind of like refined and made to have, I suppose, the sense of like tastefulness to it that provided a big sort of counterpoint to some of the yelpier, more rough around the edges and deliberately kind of messy indie that was populating what people were really, really into around this time. So the National slotted into this aesthetic where they could fit this particular mood and fit this particular vibe and really truly start to become a critics band as well. I mean, we love the National as National fans and as people who love great rock music, but this was really the point where they started to, I think, hone and fully realize how great they were at actually creating albums, like the album experience where the record has an identity that's clearly defined, and that where every single song gives you a consistent and holistic vision of what this band can be, and where none of them feel at odds with each other, where you still get diversity in terms of the heft that this band can do, but also the more stripped back, simplistic aspect of their sound where they can really refine these songs to the most pivotal elements. You get the things that were already strong about a record like Alligator. I mean, the eclectic guitar playing of Bryson Aaron Dessner, the soulful brogue and range of Matt Berninger, the, of course, ecstatic and propulsive drumming of Brian Devendorf, as well as the bass presence of Scott Devendorf as well. I mean, the drumming was fantastic on Alligator, obviously, but here it almost feels like the drumming itself has its own aesthetic. Each performer has their own aesthetic or identity or place, and they're all so interconnected and interwoven with each other and delivering their own particular brand of whatever it is they do with their instrument. And of course, we got a lot on their previous two records, a continued expansion of the presence of strings and brass and the kind of like a kind of wider, more orchestral sensibility in the background. That ramps up here more and more and more. You have a wider array of particularly brass instrument performers and woodwind instrument performers as well, really kind of letting these songs flesh out. And in a lot of ways, it feels like this is the album that the 2000s run of the National builds towards. This is the album that represents kind of the apex of what the National were moving towards. And then I would say with their next record, which we'll talk about in 2 weeks' time, they kind of repositioned themselves and started a new arc. But here, I think, is kind of like the apex of everything the National were suggesting that they could be, and everything people kind of wanted them to be in a certain sense as well, particularly critically. Off the bat as well, I will say this was an album that, weirdly enough, was not one of the National albums I got into early on in my time being a fan of the band. I was weirdly the first two National records that I really like spent a lot of time listening to were High Violet and Alligator. And it wasn't really until, and I guess Trouble Will Find Me kind of came out around the time that I was getting really into those records. And then it wasn't really until later that I started to do some back catalog digging, and Boxer made sense as the next place to go. And I think that depending on how you get into the National, whether you're at first attracted by that more rough sound of records like High Violet and Alligator, the professionalist sheen of Boxer can be somewhat, I don't want to say off-putting because that's not true either, but it can take you aback a little bit, and it's a sound and a particular aesthetic for this band that I feel like has grown in its appeal to me the older that I've gotten and the more that I've come to appreciate tastefulness in rock music. But it does represent, I would say, somewhat of a pivot from Alligator. And so I'm curious, you guys, how you guys feel about, I guess, the aesthetic, the sound of this record, the way the band have kind of developed their identity off of the back of a record like Alligator.
I always really appreciate where this album is placed in their discography, like between Alligator and High Violet, because I think it's kind of in a way of perfect transition between those two sounds. You got the more roughy, like post-punk inspired sound of Alligator, and then High Violet is where they started to get a lot more atmospheric and hazy. But with this album, to me, it's like the perfect in between those two production styles. I mean, everything here, every instrument sounds perfectly crisp. Everything is perfectly recorded here, in my opinion, and so beautifully layered. I often go between this and High Violet as my favorite National record, but I think I can settle on this one being my favorite, and that's just one of the many reasons why.
They're not mutually exclusive terms, but I think of like Alligator as like the most erratic National record, and I think of High Violet as the most anthemic National record. And there's like a meeting point or a middle ground of those two things where the rough, violent emotion of Alligator is not kind of peeled away necessarily, but it's like Matt ages into a version of himself where that is less about being manic and kind of wild and more about that mania sort of like curdling itself into a deeply rooted neurosis. It's more melancholic, it's more withdrawn, it's more sort of inward looking than the kind of like rage against, you know, the world and the people in your life that you can't get to see you or respond to you the way you want them to. And here it just kind of is this sort of gentle, quiet resentment that is more, I don't want to say it's more emotionally compelling because it's not true, but it's emotionally compelling in a really different way to a record like Alligator. Like these are songs where the emotions simmer, where you feel a sense of tension that very seldom, if ever, boils over into an explosion, but always feels like it kind of could. This kind of ever-present lingering sense of unhappiness, unease, unconfidence. That's not a word, but I'll go with it. That's what this record feels like to me. In that sense, it does. Like, as I get a little bit older, into my mid to late 20s, that starts to reflect more and more how I'm feeling versus whereas Alligator reflected more and more how I guess I felt in my early 20s. I don't know, Jake, what are your thoughts? You're familiar with all these records, but we're going through them chronologically now. So you guess you have the benefit of making these comparisons album to album. What do you think about how the National have evolved here and how like the style of songwriting has changed?
I'm glad we're doing retrospectives like this because it really gives me an opportunity to sort of get all my ducks in a row about albums or bands that I really loved and to sort of capture their narrative in a more linear format. Because as I've mentioned in the past in this retrospective, I didn't listen to the National albums in order. In fact, I listened to them in about the most random possible order you could listen to them in. So putting them in this specific context has sort of helped me fully realize some of my thoughts that I only kind of half held beforehand. And part of me is a little glad that Morgan couldn't make it this week because I was going to be I won't say ganged up on because I do really like this album, but I remember when I used to do this thing years ago when I first listened to Boxer. I remember that before we even had the podcast, I would post the listens I would have to albums daily on my Twitter account with like a little Excel spreadsheet thing. And I would just post it at the end of like a work day just because it was just like, oh, this is, a lot of my followers and mutuals or music people. And I remember the day that I posted Boxer and what I had rated for it very well because I got multiple replies to that tweet just being like, how fucking dare you? A fucking blank insert score here because I don't want to focus on the score because that's not important to me. What's important is my thoughts on the record. No, I mean, to me, it was just sort of like I didn't really grasp Boxer's reputation at the time, so I kind of approached it a bit more unassumingly. And sort of ever since then, I've thought of it as a very good record that just wasn't simply my flavor of the National or whatever. And the reason my thoughts didn't get any deeper than that is because I was just too busy listening to other albums that I liked a little bit more, and I was just a little bit less willing to go back and interrogate this just because that's a process in and of itself, and you have to take time and like stew in that, and it's a whole thing. So this gave me a great excuse to be like, what is it about this album for me that I think allows it to simultaneously work really well, but also not work as well as some other albums in this band's canon. And I think that it has a lot to do with that sort of shift that you mentioned in sort of the instrumental presence of this being a really kind of ornate, more low-key record. I mean, even the most kind of raucous moments on this album, like Mistaken for Strangers, like it's still really subdued. It's still really subtle. And this band's really good at that and sort of like writing that line. But at the same time, I'm trying to put this in a way that won't make my opinion seem incredibly unnuanced. But I think my overriding problem with Boxer is that it just doesn't really do anything that I feel like this band haven't done before. Like, sure, it's a little bit more focused and trims away some of the parts of Alligator, but like that's one of the reasons that I really like Alligator is that it has a dynamism to it where it has a raucous sound and a more ornamental sound that it blends really, really well. And it leads it to being kind of messy, sure, but I think we spoke to the fact that that's part of the appeal of that record. And I'm sure that the scaling back is part of the appeal of this record as well. It's just that it definitely loses something when a lot of the topics, ideas, relationships, lyrical themes, they're all things that they talked about on the self-titled, on Sad Songs for Dirty Lovers, on Alligator, and they don't really do that much more with it, for me anyway. Like I get emotionally invested in some of these songs, but like this is conversely an album that I think is a better album experience than something like Sad Songs for Dirty Lovers, and is like a superior record to that overall, but I have more fondness for that record because I gravitate towards its messier highs a little bit more. Like there's nothing on here that I like quite as much as something like Cardinal Song on that album. And for as, you know, as insane a take as that might be for some National fans, it's just that whenever I interrogate a lot of the ideas on here, it's just sort of something that's like, this just feels like something I've heard before, and it lacks an edge that was also present before. It doesn't ever lead to it being significant enough for me to say that this is a record that is in any way subpar. I think that in many ways, this is probably like the most straightforwardly consistent record the band have put out thus far. Even though Alligator is great and I prefer that record, it still has like a couple moments where, you know, maybe refining of some of their lyrical ideas or some of their like messier tendencies could have been changed to suit a more holistic vibe. But here it feels like something is missing for me personally, and I know that that probably isn't helped by the fact that I listened to all these other albums like in a completely different order, so I never really got how the band got from A to B in many respects. But it also means that like I have gravitated towards the way that this band have used Boxer as a kind of blueprint for what they are going to do on basically every other album after this. So it's like I'm in a very constantly fluctuating, very frustrating place of like, I really like all of this, and it's also just like it's a bit infuriating a little bit.
Look, Jake, I relate, honestly, genuinely. This was actually, for the longest time, this was my third least favorite, you know, above the two at the bottom, the first two albums. And I had my hot take sort of National fans sort of like, watch out, I think Boxer is just great, not like, you know, the cure for cancer.
That's ridiculous.
For starters, a concept we've talked about a lot is when an album is kind of held up in a particular level of esteem or as like this distilled essence of a band, you know, and it's most kind of refined and perfect, that can be just the thing, but it can also be kind of like not exactly the best way you want to experience a band necessarily. Maybe you want to hear them taking more risks. Maybe you want to hear them kind of pushing away at the boundaries a little bit. And sometimes so appeal matters here as well. But also there is an uptightness to this record. There is a sense of, like I described it as tension, which is a little bit more of a positive spin on it than uptightness. But I don't even mean either of those words negatively. There's just a sense of an angst that permeates this record. So much of this record is describing the sense of inner turmoil in a way that doesn't have the kind of outward danger or cutting brutality of the way he's expressed it on records up to this point. And musically, the album is so tastefully refined that if you're looking for a certain level of edge as well, for the most part, you're probably not going to get that musically or lyrically. And so that was kind of what held me back for a while as well, was this sense that everything was so refined on this album that I felt like I wasn't necessarily getting the most adventurous or thrilling version of this band that I could possibly get. And I think that's especially true when you start and when you hear some of the louder, more raucous records than this one first. And so that's where I was for the longest time, where it was like I loved and still obviously love the huge songs on this. Songs like Fake Empire, Mistaken for Strangers, Slow Show, Apartment Story. You know, those are all-timer National songs. Those are songs that you can guarantee at least 3 out of 4, if not all of them, will be played at every National show, you know, probably forever, because they're just that big and that iconic. And so there was, to a certain extent, in a sense, which I was like, the record for a while felt so dominated by those songs. And I had this feeling where it was like, I really responded to the first half of each side of the record, like the first few songs on each of the two sides. And then as the sides went on, I kind of like, my attention sort of drifted away a little bit. That was my initial sort of relationship as well. But I have had a real journey coming to appreciate the deep cuts of this record and coming to view Boxer again, it's almost like it feels like a cheap way of describing it, but like almost Boxer more than any other National album is the one I view the most as a single entity as opposed to a collection of songs. And this to me is like an album that breathes in and out from one song to the next. Some tracks are like this deep inhale of air that are filled with this kind of tension. Songs like Start a War, songs like Squalor Victoria. These are songs that feel like they're in a suspended state where something kind of calamitous is about to happen, but never does. And then there are other songs on the record where you feel like you're getting that exhalation, you're getting that explosion, you know, not to the same extent as you got explosions on Alligator, but you're getting that sense of the tension boiling over. Again, in songs like, you know, Slow Show, Mistaken for Strangers, Guest Room, you know, the songs where the record really feel like animates itself in a more overt way. And so for me, coming to love Boxer was appreciating not just that was how the record was structured in terms of moving fairly consistently from these inhalation moments of tension to these kind of release moments from one track to the next. Not only, you know, understanding that, but actually appreciating that that is how the record has to be in order for it to work, at least and the way I experience it now. I seldom listen to songs like Apartment Story or Ada or Brainy in and of themselves. I almost always hear them when I'm listening to Boxer, because so much of the effect, and maybe this is actually better exemplified by the deep cuts, songs like Squalor Victoria, Start a War, Racing Like a Pro, Gospel, like so many of these songs that in and of themselves as isolated tracks may not amount to much, add so much power to what surrounds them on the record, and then what surrounds them on the record feeds back an energy into them that makes it all feel like this organic breathing entity. I know I love to describe albums as breathing entities on this podcast. It's just a kind of thing that I've gotten to do. So yeah, that's my, I guess, a relationship with Boxer it's sort of shifted the way that I viewed it. And obviously that's not enough to make a record click, just shifting your view. The songs will click or they won't. But I do think that my appreciation for the craft of this and the beauty of it as a holistic statement is so tied up in how these songs respond to and interrogate each other. And there's even like lyrical motifs that carry across certain tracks as well. This is maybe the only album in the world where the word ruffian is used in more than one song, let alone at all. There is a sense that the emotional states of these songs are, if not directly interacting with each other, then like responding to an earlier statement or feeling. I mean, just think about the way that the album pivots from Fake Empire into Mistaken for Strangers, right? That 1-2 punch, one of the most iconic 1-2 punches in this band's entire discography. And it lays out so much of what the band are in just these two songs. You have the gentle kind of auspicious beginning of Fake Empire with those lilting strings and those iconic piano notes that sound like they're overlapping but also running circles around each other. And that particular, I cannot praise the way that Matt's vocals are mic'd and mixed by Peter Cadis on this record enough. He sounds like the only singer there ever has been in some weird way. Like he just, every word he says, not even what they are, but just the way he sings them is perfect. His enunciation, his confidence as a performer, his mellowness, but also his control of his baritone is so good. But yeah, you get that softness boiling into a kind of like ecstasy of horns and swirling instrumentation with the climax of Fake Empire. And then you get this heavily distorted kind of raging song in Mistaken for Strangers, which is like so pent up and freaking out. It's such a contrast from Fake Empire, which has this kind of like sense of resignation and sort of like almost having come to terms with the state of ennui or like unhappiness that you exist in. And then all of a sudden in Mistaken for Strangers, you're freaking out about it. And that is the that's the binary of the National, I suppose. It's something we kind of talked about that happened somewhat inconsistently, but still happened on Alligator as well. And here it feels like it's done in a way that feels more natural, where you kind of get a sense, and I can't ever imagine this because I cannot imagine hearing this for the first time again, but you almost get a certain sense where you can tell what the next song is going to be like just from one song after a while, because there's just a logical next step for the way this mood or this tone or this set of stories should evolve, and it happens that way. Anyway, that's my long-winded, very abstract appreciation for this record. Connor, you are the National connoisseur. That's almost a pun. I mean, I don't know how, I feel like we've probably been into the band for about the same amount of time, but I still consider you to be like almost the preeminent authority on them among my friends. So why don't you talk a little bit about, I guess, how you feel on the whole about what this record is and why it means something to you?
Boxer, for me, I think it was, I want to say it was probably the second National album I got into. The first one was, of course, High Violet, because I had first heard Blood Buzz Ohio and was just absolutely floored by that song. I was like, I need to hear more music like this, specifically indie music, where I could actually sing along to with my deep ass voice.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, and while High Violet to me is an absolutely perfect record in every sense, there's not a single track that I don't think is essentially a masterpiece. This album, when I listened to it, I was just kind of want to say I was blown away, but at the same time, like I understand why it's not necessarily everyone's favorite and why it doesn't hit everyone the same way that it hit me when I first heard it, because you're right, it's not quite as dynamic as something like Alligator. It's not quite as explosive as Alligator either. But the way this album is produced, mixed, arranged, there's so much space within this mix. There's so many layers. There's so many subtle moments that I heard that I'd never heard in any record. I've never heard anything like this at the time. Like especially a song like Fake Empire, which to this day is, it's hard to pick a favorite National song, but Fake Empire is one of the absolute strongest contenders. It's up there for me with Blood Buzz Ohio, Geese of Beverly Road, All the Wine. It's just that level of perfection. And like you were saying, Riley, this album is, I think, some of the tightest and most consistent that they've ever been. And that's one thing that I really loved about it, was just how perfectly constructed and arranged that these songs were. But also going into kind of a little bit of the themes is, as I've gotten older, I've realized how this is probably one of the best examples of accurately depicting the inevitable monotony of transitioning into adulthood that I've ever heard in music. And it's laid out like in that first song, Half Awake, in A Fake Empire.
I cannot tell you how much time I've spent in my life thinking about that lyric, because like it's the surface reading, obviously the political application of it, the Bush years when this came out, the tail end of that, all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. But you can read that lyric and interpret it in so many different ways, or apply it to so many different feelings, and it is like, no matter what context you're applying it, it is an incredibly powerful sentiment, as well as being a beautifully constructed lyric, just semantically as well. And I also like how, the political dimension of this song, and it's like the next song in the album discography after Mr. November as well. So it kind of almost plays like a wizened aftermath to that song's kind of frantic mania and sense of self-delusion. And then the delusion passes and you are older and more understanding of the way that things are and the way that things have to be. I think that while this, still isn't my favorite National album, and probably still isn't even in my top 3 somehow, I do think this album represents Matt Berninger's peak as a lyricist. And for as beautifully arranged as it all is, and we'll touch on some aspects of that, I suppose, the vast majority of what I want to talk about on this record is just the lyrics. Because this album lyrically is astonishingly impactful to me. It is a masterclass in lyricism. Connor, I was just saying to you yesterday that I feel like if you were to teach songwriting in some kind of like entry-level course, this should be one of the texts on the required listens, I suppose, instead of readings, but I guess it is reading as well. This should be a required text for learning and developing songwriting skills. Everything about this record in terms of how these songs are constructed lyrically and how the sentiments are expressed is a masterclass in poeticism, in emotion, in conveyance of a feeling, and also just on the, on the level of just how it all sounds as well, and how like satisfying it is to sing along to, and how satisfying it is to read and say, and the little motifs that Matt Berninger uses as well, the way that he is able to, for instance, contrast a very kind of refined and almost formal sensibility in the way that he sings with sentiments, lyrical motifs, little word choices that feel kind of incongruous with that formality as well. Like the way "stay out super late tonight," like that expression of super late in the very first line, or doing a gay ballet on ice, like the way he's able to, in a similar way to what he did on Alligator as well, conjure these almost surrealistic images to paint a picture of, being an adult and being drunk and cavorting with someone, or, that kind of experience, and giving that a sense of fanciful theatrics that almost stands as a sharp contrast in juxtaposition to the incredibly refined and composed way that he actually sings. And sometimes this contrast can be used to devastating effect, where he can deliver a line and he will say it in the most sort of straightforward and composed way possible, and that will somehow make it a million times more heart-wrenching. Like the way, my favorite set of lines in this song, where at the end he's like, "Turn the light out, say goodnight, no thinking for a little while." It's almost hypnotic. "Let's try not to figure out everything at once. It's hard to keep track of you falling through the sky." Like those lines are so evocative and impactful and powerful, and so much of that feeling comes from how, I don't even want to say under-delivered they are, because that's not the right word, but he doesn't overemphasize or like try to give weight to his words in the way that more kind of, I suppose, histrionic or theatrical songwriters would. And not that being histrionic or theatrical is necessarily a bad thing, but Matt knows how best to serve his sentiments. No thinking for a little while. Let's not try to figure out everything at once. I mean, you read some of the lyrics of this album on paper, and they almost seem too simple or too blunt, or even like artless. Like sometimes one of the great Berningerisms that I've referred to in the past, and that is more prominent here, is that he will like construct lines, but he will deliberately repeat a word in a way that in typical English writing and poetry, you're not really supposed to do, because it kind of means you're hitting the same notes twice in a row. Just like how in a typical sentence, you're not supposed to use the same word twice, especially if it's one of the nouns or verbs in the sentence, right? It's just wrong. Whereas he will do that all the time. He will sometimes repeat the same word immediately after he said it, or later in the same line. And it's just one of these little tools he has, where if he was really emoting in a kind of Abel-esque sort of way, or a Slipping Husband-esque sort of way, it would kind of feel, forced, and it would feel kind of farcical. But when he underplays it, it's almost like in repeating a word, or in deliberately simplifying a sentiment as much as possible, he's making it hit harder for some reason. He's making you hear that thought in a way you never had before. And there's so many examples of motif repetition on every song on this record. Mistaken for Strangers does it as well. The lines, "You don't mind seeing yourself in a picture as long as you look far away, as long as you look removed." showered in blue blazered, fill yourself with quarters. A lot of refrains are repeated over and over again. Under the silvery Citibank lights, arm in arm in arm, and eyes glazing under. Surprise, surprise. Uninnocent, elegant, unmagnificent. There's clunkiness, there's repetition, there's things that he does, and he finds a rhythm in it, but he does them and they shouldn't work on paper. And it's, for some reason, his ability to sell those things, like for some reason, describing the Citibank lights as silvery twice makes it more visual. Using words like uninnocent and unmagnificent and to line straight doesn't feel like someone who isn't able to come up with the right word, but someone who is deliberately mangling English and syntax and grammar to make a point. And it's super effective. Like I'm intellectualizing it a bit here because I do that, but I've tried for so long to figure out what it is about the way Matt writes that I love. And I feel like he has this command of the English language, and also this kind of, like I described it before, as hypnotic way of singing, where lines kind of run into each other, and he's singing in this consistent tone. So you're kind of like almost moving into here, and he's kind of pulling you along through one line after the next, and it's just kind of continuously going. I think one of the most stark and impactful examples of this is the way he sings Slow Show. The verses on Slow Show, the lines are running into each other. He's almost like mumbling them, and he's saying them kind of like faster than you think maybe they should be said initially. Standing at the punch table, swallowing punch. Again, it's almost like a joke, that opening line, like that kind of redundant repetition that is just emphasizing the monotony. Can't pay attention to the sound of anyone, a little more stupid, a little more scared, every minute more unprepared. And then of course you have, the lines that are like, on paper, they're like, what are you doing, man? But yet he sells it in a way that's like, yeah, bro, I feel it. Like, can I get a minute of not being nervous and not thinking of my dick? And especially not even just mentioning his dick in the song, which is not the first time he's done that, but also the fact that that line kind of plays almost like it ends in a way, like the emphasis on dick is so like unplayed and sort of restrained that it almost feels like the line just kind of evaporates in front of him. And it's so good at evoking that sense of the mind state the song wants to put you in, of being, of the sense of longing, of the sense of confusion, of the sense of wanting to make things right but not knowing how to do that. And then you have lines like, I leaned on the wall and the wall leaned away, which is just like one of the most fucking devastating little lines that anyone's ever written ever. There's just so much here in the way that Matt writes and in the way these songs come across that I think is what makes the record in a lot of ways.
This is one of those albums where even though, like you said, he's kind of subtly delivering a lot of these lyrics, a lot of these lines, there's always like lines that you will never forget because they're just so distinctively Matt Berninger.
Yeah.
Lines like you wouldn't want an angel watching over, surprise, surprise, they wouldn't want to watch, which and then like another uninnocent, elegant fall into the unmagnificent lives of adults, like that.
Yeah,
just like that right there is like the thesis of the album for me. It's like just the monotony of like growing up and getting old.
I even think about like how Matt's lyricism has evolved here, because all Alligator has so much lyricism I love, right? That's deliberately kind of like garish and sometimes vulgar. And I think about the lyric from Karen where he's like, it's a common fetish for a doting man to ballerina on the coffee table, cock in hand. And then there's a lyric in Green Gloves where he says, Cinderella through the room, I glide and swan, because I'm the best slow dancer in the universe. And essentially to me, the sentiment is exactly the same. This idea of like, inflated grandiosity under the influence. But he's found a way to refine that to something that is more understated and almost more impactful. This idea of this, this guy who again is almost whispering to you basically everything he says, describing himself as Cinderella and the best slow dancer in the universe. It's like there's something about the way he matches these kinds of grandiose comparisons with this incredibly understated delivery that makes it feel almost funny in a certain sense. Like this is kind of a record that has a more subtle sense of humor than the National have had before, but also I feel like that sense of humor shouldn't be overlooked either.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of themes here that I think really relate back to just the monotony of life. I always really loved Squalor Victoria in particular. I always thought that was one of the most underrated National tracks, especially with the way it starts with those drums and the swelling strings, and then
brutal. It's like listening to
amazing,
like 4 heartbeats sort of just out of time from each other and just kind of barreling through the song. I like the way that the drums just never stop.
Absolutely. And when that piano riff comes in with the do 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 do, and really like, oh, this is where the song's going. And I also, another thing that's not so much necessarily about the lyrics, but about Matt's like delivery. I think a lot of his delivery, even though it is very low key, there's a lot of like really nice and memorable melodies, and also almost like non-melodies. Like when you read some of the lines, they don't really flow, but when you listen to the record, he kind of fits them, almost shoehorns them, but in like the best way possible. Squalor Victoria is not necessarily an example of this, because like this whole song, he has this like underline everything, I'm a professional, and like just hearing that is just almost like a hypnotic delivery.
He does that a lot on the record, where he will like find a vocal melody and he'll kind of hammer it for multiple lines.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
In Green Gloves, he does it as well. Falling out of touch with all my friends, or somewhere getting wasted. Like he's giving you a little bit of tension and resolution with the way those lines end melodically, but he still hits the same sort of beats or flows, I guess flows, to use hip hop terminology. And it's again one of those things that shouldn't work. It should feel monotonous, and I guess maybe for some people it does, but I mean, for me at least, it's he treads that line between being monotonous and being hypnotic, and he's more of the latter than the former.
There's also like a lot of like non-lyric lines that he like on a song like Brainy, which is actually one of my favorite National songs, where he at the end of every line, he kind of does that and just like that little much, it just adds so much character to this album. And then like you said, repeated lines like on Squalor Victoria, where he's like zone out, zone out, zone out, zone out.
Yeah,
like almost like he's like fading out, or like I don't know, it's hard to describe like how this album makes me feel, because everything is really subtle, but it just adds up to create this incredibly like emotional and personal impact. Like I feel like this, whenever I listen to this album, I'm just like, it becomes my world for 45 minutes. Like
it's like there's this quality of the way he sings. It almost sounds like someone who is like in an in-between state between being conscious and unconscious, which again fits in with the vibe of someone being like seriously wine drunk and just kind of like, wrapping their arm around someone and just kind of mumbling to them. But again, what the way I describe Matt's delivery on this album, the 2 words I would use is quiet urgency. I think that really encapsulates how he communicates and what his style is. And my favorite example of this, one of my favorite National songs personally, certainly one of my favorite National deep cuts, is Start a War, the 8th track on here, which, fun fact for you, when this album was originally being assembled, this was going to be the opening track, which is kind of insane. But eventually they I think Fake Empire might have been one of the last songs they actually wrote, and eventually ended up reshuffling and I think the sequencing now is basically flawless. You could not improve the sequencing of this record, I don't think, with these same 12 songs.
I can't imagine this album not starting with Fake Empire.
I know, right? But anyway, Start a War, like, again, maybe the most underplayed song on this record in terms of like every element of it is so restrained. The guitar line is like deceptively simple. It oscillates from feeling like comforting and warm to feeling the opposite of that, cold and kind of tense. And a part of that is how it interacts with the horns that come in the background in the second half of the song, and the way the tension builds with the really low sort of like gentle drumming that kind of adds a sense of very subtle urgency as it goes on. But also the way the sentiments in this record are kind of so sort of gently longing and devastating and almost pleading on page, but again, underplayed so much in terms of the vocal performance. We expected something better than before. We expected something more. Do you really think you can just put it in a safe behind a painting, lock it up and leave? Whatever went away, I'll get it over again. I'll get money, I'll get funny again. You were always weird, but I never had to hold you by the edges like I do now. Walk away and you're going to start a war. Like, this whole song is just those 5 or 6 lines essentially repeated over and over and over again. And each one of them feels like both a plea and a threat at the same time, right? It is this sense of, you don't know, you don't have context for any of these things. You can obviously interpret that there's some kind of, domestic thing happening here, a dispute or a relationship that is kind of falling apart. But the information you don't have is what makes it so much more powerful. And that's true lyrically and musically. It's the filling out that you don't have. It's the fact that you only have these little instrumental parts that are just repeating and sort of adding to each other and kind of countering all that sort of stuff over and over and over again. And these lines that are repeating themselves over and over and over again and not giving you any context. It's a masterclass in minimalism, this song, I think. And it's just so good at doing that, at capturing that state and leaving you suspended in it for 3 minutes. And of course, that to me is one of the greatest strengths of Boxer. I don't think any of their other albums do that in the same way.
I think, like, even though it's towards the end, I really love the last 3 songs on this album, even though this album really doesn't end with a bang whatsoever, like Alligator or High Violet kind of do. They're just really subtly beautiful songs, like the incredibly sad but almost like fast plucked guitar on Racing Like a Pro, or Racing Like a Pronoun, as some fans call it.
I always call it Racing Like a Pronoun in any context. That is just what it is to me now. But yeah, that's a great song. It's another one of those songs where it's just like the music is so simple, and it's almost like the little kind of acoustic picked line is just kind of like oscillating over and over again. And lyrically, Matt's delivery is kind of like doing the same sort of thing, underplaying every line. And again, that underplaying is what lends the lines so much impact to me. Sometimes you get up and bake a cake or something. Sometimes you stay in bed. Sometimes you go la-di-da-di-da-di-da-da until your eyes roll back into your head. Like, both the way he says those lines and what they actually contain, to me, that's like an amazing depiction of like being horrifically depressed, and very few songwriters will ever come close to it, because so many of them feel the need to sensationalize or play up the sense of emotional gravity, when all it really is the fact that sometimes you get up and bake a cake or something. Like, it's a shrug of a line, but it ends with this idea of someone just kind of dissociating and their eyes rolling back into their head, and they're just kind of losing the ability to speak. And to me, it hits so hard. And then the way he's like, on a record where you get very little emphasis on any of the lyrics, you still get emphasis on lines like, oh my God, it was 1,000,000 years ago. And like the way he sings that chorus, it feels, it cuts, it hits hard, it's devastating. And it's almost like, again, it's one of those songs that doesn't end with any kind of resolution. It just ends with you being dumbstruck and aware of it and powerless. It's a song about being powerless. And I I fucking love it. Also, this is the part where I get to drop one of my single favorite factoid about the making of this record, which is that the piano you hear on this song
Sufjan Stevens
on Ada is played by Sufjan Stevens. That's right.
Yep.
I don't actually, I assume composed by him as well, because that piano line on Ada is like so iconic to me. Like that's automatically starts playing in my head whenever the song is mentioned or whenever I see this song. It's such a beautiful little flourish.
I like discovered that fact like way after, not realizing that. And when you listen back to it, like you can hear it distinctly is Sufjan, like the piano playing style. Like if you're familiar with his music, it really has that touch and has that flavor.
Yeah.
And it's also kind of like almost just melodically or sonically almost one of the more darker sounding songs on the album for me. And I haven't read as much into the lyrics of this one, but I always found like that, like just that really like dreary refrain, like all up in the air.
Yeah, and
and he
it's
just
like
like
so
drones that out.
downbeat, and the horns are so sort of like mournful, and then you get that kind of like flourish moment at the bridge where he's like, Ada, I can hear the sound of your laugh through the wall. There's a lot actually, and I was going to bring this up as well. There's a lot of misheard lyrics on this record, and you find a number of national Reddit threads talking about this as well, or just like memes, where like a lot of people, myself included, used to think this line was, I can hear the sound of your life through the wall, but it's laugh. Another example is on Brainy. One of probably the single most misheard national lyric, at least that I can think of, is come home in the car you love, which I and many other people have always heard as come on baby call me love, which it's not. It's come home in the car you love, which is a better lyric, honestly, obviously. But there's this, and
I love that song so much.
Oh, it's so good. And that's a quality, I guess, of the way Matt sings here, is he almost kind of like invites that to a certain extent as well. It's the same reason why I feel like no one really ever picks up on the thinking of my dick line until they actually read the lyrics to Slow Show, because it's just so underplayed. So good. And we haven't even mentioned my favorite deep cut on this record, which is the song Guest Room. This song again comes at the perfect moment as well. It just reignites after the boiling tension of Star to War. It has like one of the most weirdly funny opening lines of any national song. They're going to send us to prison for jerks. Which is such a funny thing to say. Like such a almost parodic sort of upper middle class sentiment as well, like not just going to prison but going to the prison for jerks, like being like ostracized from your social group because you've done some kind of faux pas and you're going to be sent to prison for jerks. And the whole thing is just kind of like this ostentatious, like over the top parodic sort of image of being in the guest room, throwing money in each other and crying and being sad together about the lost youth you never really capitalized on. And it's this like sense of this upper class environment where these shallow people play these meaningless games and get ridiculously drunk to pretend their life has any kind of meaning. And it's effective because Matt doesn't feel like he's taking the piss out of these people as much as he feels like he is one of those people. And he's kind of like doing both of those things. And that's kind of what gives it its power. Also, one of my favorite key changes in all of music is 2 minutes into the song, where it just like the key changes upward and it just has this completely foreign level of weird urgency and longing that it didn't have in the first 2 minutes of the song. It's just gorgeous. It's masterful. It's everything. I fucking love it. God.
Yeah, it's a beautiful song. And again, like the way the drums are kind of the active drumming of Brian Devendorf being contrasted with the really dreamy dueling guitars, like really atmospheric guitars of the Desner brothers. Like this and Brainy does that as well. It's a very distinctive characteristic about this album. And on the top, not to completely change topics from this song, but like on the topic of favorite key changes, I have to mention the ending of Slow Show, which is one of my favorite moments in all of the Nationals discography, where it calls back to the debut album. Is the song, I haven't heard the debut in a while. Is it 29 Years? Is that what it's called? Right.
Is, yeah.
That would make sense because, I think about you for 29 years. And
Dreamed about you even.
Oh, dreamed. Yeah. I'm so bad with lyrics.
Have you even heard this album? You fucking fake fan.
I can tell you, I've listened to so many albums, like so many of my favorite albums, and I'll get the lyrics wrong every time, just because my brain always hears them incorrectly or something. But yeah, just like that moment where that piano comes in and plays that do 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 do.
It's like
that shit hurt.
It's the indie rock equivalent of like the fucking beat switch on Frank Ocean's Nights. Put that shit in the fuck as a pull quote. Thinking about it, like on the note of Guest Room as well, like there's so many iconic drum fills and lines on this record. I think Guest Room has my favorite drumming of the whole album. It's just so violent. Like Brian is really coming into his own in terms of realizing this particular drum sound he has, which is where every snare hit feels like your ear is being bursted with white noise for like every snare hit. Like they're so loud. It's such a kind of like brutal sound as well. And he plays so fast and with such swing as well, and his ability to kind of like switch it up. And he does that really well in the Guest Room drum line, where it kind of goes all over the fucking place a little bit. And it's disorienting in the same way, as you say, in the same way that swirling arpeggiated guitar is. And you get that amazing counter melody in the last part of the song. It's just, it's class. But
that snare drum is like, it's just, I mean, like, again, little details, like just that snare drum is just so tight and so crisp. Like if you were to find in an alternate universe the exact opposite of the Saint Anger snare, it would be the Boxer snare right here.
Yeah, I feel like if Brian Devendorf switched out for Lars Ulrich on Saint Anger, I'm all I'm saying is I'd want to hear that. I want to hear what that sounded like.
There should be an edit. Like Fake Empire is like, don't.
I just want to hear him doing all the fills on that album. But yeah, the biggie that we haven't talked about yet that I kind of wanted to sort of make the climax of this conversation, my favorite song on the album, although that has changed over the years, but currently, Apartment Story, the lead-off track on the B-side of this album. This is, I think, one of the greatest songs ever written by anyone. I said that on Twitter the other day. I stand by it. It is, I mean, it's fun. Like every National album has like one of the greatest indie rock songs of all time on it, or at least the albums from like Alligator through to, I guess, the present day. But if I'm being really discerning, I would probably say Alligator through Trouble Will Find Me. Those 4 records each have like one song on it that's like an indie rock staple, where everyone agrees, even if you're not a huge fan of the National, that this song is the one. And if you're familiar with the National, the other ones on those other 3 records are obvious. I mean, Alligator, to me, it's All the Wine, or Mr. November, I guess, either or. Here it's Apartment Story. High Violet, it's Blood Buzz, Ohio, and Trouble Will Find Me. I mean, I guess there's a few contenders there, but the one that came to mind for me was Graceless on that album, but there's a few.
Yeah.
But anyway, here it's Apartment Story, right? This is the apotheosis in a lot of ways of what this band have been building towards in terms of each member's musical proficiency, but also the longing and power of Matt's writing as well. I mean, Geese of Beverly Road hit that on Alligator, and this is very much, to me, the Geese of Beverly Road of this album thematically. This idea, it doesn't have the kind of like wistfulness of, well, it has a wistfulness, but it doesn't have the kind of like naivety or sort of, I guess, life-affirming positivity that song has. That positivity is curdled over a little bit more, but there is this sense of comfort in the song, or acceptance, right? this idea that, yeah, it's a song about being incredibly tired and incredibly over it in every sense, and every aspect of your life feeling like it is either mundane or diving off of the balcony, right? Like, it is a song about accepting that state of mind as well, but also, it's optimistic in a weird way. Again, that worry not, all things are well, we'll be all right, we have our looks and perfume. Like, it's a bit sarcastic, obviously, but it almost feels like there's a genuine underpinning sense of acceptance and positivity under that. And it's, I think, the only moment on the record where that comes through really strongly. And it makes this the centerpiece of the album.
You mentioned how High Violet is kind of the anthemic album of the Nationals, at least in terms of these big three that we've been talking about for this episode. This song in particular, I feel like, is the one truly anthemic moment of the album, which makes it so much more memorable, especially that last refrain with the "so worry not all thing," which whenever that moment comes on, you just like, I can't not sing along. It's just such a perfect
when
moment.
you see them live as well, like, and this is true of basically most lyrics on this record as well, like, Matt is shouting these lines, he's not delivering them like he does on the record. And that's one of the things that makes the National a great band, is they know how to best perform for the album format and then to change that for the live format. And when I saw them live, and Matt was like bellowing "worry not," like just all those lyrics at the top of his lungs, and I was too, it's like the best shit in the world. Like, it's and that's the sign of a great songwriter, right? As the lyrics work in any context, no matter how they're delivered, you get a power out of them.
It's such a simple and very memorable melody as well, that everyone can just, because it is, like you said, it's kind of like the one of the few optimistic moments on the record, so you want it to be very memorable and, for lack of a better word, catchy. And also, like, this, I feel like this song in particular, it's such a beloved National song that I almost feel like that a lot of their songs in the future would kind of be inspired by the blueprint that this song goes for. Like, to me, when I first heard the song Rylan from I'm Not Easy to Find, it instantly reminded me of this song, mainly because the drum beat has that same like the thing that is just propelling the song. And this is just one of their best songs by far. So good that I actually recorded this song by myself for a music tech final project class. It's just such like a incredible song. Easily one of my favorite songs of all time. It means so much to me. Like, I'm kind of at a loss for words because it's just that good. Every single thing about it, from that bass and guitar that kind of blend together, along with that giant organ sound that I absolutely love. And man, yeah, it's fucking Apartment Story. Go listen to it if you haven't.
Yeah, right. Let's box her up and do our favorite tracks and ratings.
3 favorite tracks are Mistaken for Strangers, Ada, and Fake Empire. Least favorite track, it's either Squalor Victoria or Racing Like a Pro, and I give it a 7.5.
Alrighty. Morgan didn't give me his favorite tracks, but very much be assured this is a Morgan 10 out of 10. My favorite tracks are Apartment Story, Mistaken for Strangers, and Fake Empire. I mean, there's literally no takes that aren't incredibly Antarctically cold there, but whatever. Least favorite track, don't have one, and this album gets a 9.5 from me.
So my 3 favorite tracks are Fake Empire, Apartment Story, and it's cliche, but I don't care. Mistaken for Strangers. I don't have a least favorite, and this gets a 10.
All right, which gives us an average of 9.3 for the Nationals Boxer. Let us know at home what Boxer means to you. Where in your album ranking would you put it? Do you think it deserves to be right at the top of the pile with their absolute best records? Or do you think that the hype is a little bit oversold and you would have it a bit lower? Let us know what your thoughts are, what your relationship is with this album. We want to hear in the comments below. Make sure that if you enjoyed this discussion, you consider giving it a like and, of course, subscribing to the channel so you don't miss future episodes of the National Retrospective, which drop every other Friday. We will be back in 2 weeks' time to talk about High Violet, and I can promise you that's going to be a fucking video because I have a lot of shit to say about High Violet, and I know I won't be the only one. So stick around for that as well. If you want to go above and beyond and support the channel, you can hit the join button, and for just $1 a month, you can support us directly, get your name featured in the title crawl of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us some music to listen to and talk about, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. As always, though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Bailey's, the original Irish dream.